Good evening and welcome to tonight's forum on gun violence. My name is Tara Corbett and I'm a senior Periclean scholar. I've had the pleasure of serving on the committee to plan this event. We've come together tonight to hear several perspectives through both our expert and community panelists. And the purpose of this event is to discuss many areas of this issue of violence related to the use of guns. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Dr. Connie Ladeau-Book, Associate Provost of Academic Affairs and Professor of Communications. She has been teaching at Elon for nearly 15 years and has received countless honors and awards for her work within her chosen discipline of communications. Dr. Book is also co-chair of the Council on Civic Engagement. Elon University defines civic engagement as the process of learning about the assets, needs, and concerns of the larger communities of which we are a part, and the willingness to collaborate with others to help define and achieve the common good. We are pleased to have a moderator who represents these values so well. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Book.
Thank you, Tara. And thanks to everyone for being here tonight. And for those joining us electronically, we welcome you as well. We're really pleased to see so many Elon students and members of our local community, something that doesn't happen very often throughout the academic year, but particularly on this topic, which affects all of us. The seed for tonight's discussion began shortly after the events of Sandy Hook, when Emerson College President Lee Pelton, in a letter to President Obama, called on universities to pledge to do what we do best in our academic communities: engage thought leaders, faculty, students, staff, trustees, and friends in meaningful debate and dialogue, which in turn might lead to positive action. President Lambert signed that letter on behalf of Elon University, and that is why we are gathered here this evening. At Elon, we have a mission that embraces engaged learning as the engine of hope and prosperity for our democracy. That learning, like tonight's discussion, brings passion and personal conviction to the table. These ingredients can make for tough but transformative conversation. We've intentionally designed tonight's conversation on gun violence that engages first listening, then questioning, and respectful consideration of our differences. As remarks are being made, if you're prompted with a question, we've provided a card on your seat to write the question that you would like asked. We have people in the aisle, so just raise your card and they will collect your question. We will collect those, and they will be the basis of our interactive portion of the program tonight. I'd like to start tonight's conversation by saying we begin on common ground. The common ground is our wholesale rejection of violence. No one in this community is supportive of violence. And so from that common ground, we welcome each and every one of you and your ideas to the table tonight. So let's get started. Ben on the front row, Ben Rashton is also co-chairing the committee that designed our panel discussion tonight, and he'll be our timekeeper. So each of our panelists that were selected to present tonight have 3 minutes to make a personal statement. Following those personal statements, we'll turn to our panel of experts from our community to each give 3 to 5 minutes of remarks about their work and their thoughts in this area. So let's begin with student Samantha Allen.
Hello, my name is Samantha Allen. I'm a freshman here at Elon. I'm an Elon College Fellow, and I plan on majoring in anthropology and sociology. Today in this gun violence debate, I want to take the focus off of guns and onto mental health. I think that taking a gun away from a person won't make them any less violent, and we need to tap into where this violence is coming from. The first motivation I want to talk about is male anger and aggression, the need to express masculinity. In the last 30 years, there have been 62 mass shootings in the United States. Out of all the killers, only one was a woman. Our nation has associated guns with power and power and control with being a man. Another way to understand this motivation is to look into our mental state. Mental health is a major issue in our nation, and the thing is, it's a tricky subject because it's always evolving. Sometimes it's a combination of things. Many times an individual has a combination of illnesses that is causing the problem. Also, the definitions of different mental illnesses have changed over time, and an illness that was previously perceived as causing social anxiety or withdrawal is now associated with violent or aggressive behavior. What I do want to say is that mental illness does not cause violence, and the stigma and discrimination of those with mental illness is also a major issue in our nation. But the problem is, left untreated, those with mental illness are predisposed to violence. A person with mental illness is 3 times more likely to commit a minor to serious violent act than someone without. Early intervention is key, and mental health care needs to be just as important as other health care. The problem is, our nation doesn't want to talk about it. When we see someone bleeding or in need of help, we run to them, but if we see someone acting out of the ordinary, we turn our eye and hope it goes away. We need to address this issue head on. The nation needs to be educated on mental illnesses, and we need to implement policies that will stop future violent acts. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Bass, and I'm a freshman here at Elon. And as a passionate hunter and gun owner, I would like to offer my thoughts regarding gun violence. In recent weeks, gun and ammunition sales have skyrocketed in response to gun control legislation. In 2010, there were an estimated 300 million privately owned firearms in the US. Now, there are arguably more guns than there are people due to the recent surge in sales, which means that there is not a correlation between the number of guns and the number of murders. There is a presumption that strict gun regulation will reduce the number of gun-related deaths. But imposing gun regulation upon the law-abiding will not regulate the lawless. The U.S. Department of Justice prosecuted 44 out of 48,000 illegal gun purchases. Their annual report said, quote, "Funding constraints had hurt the effectiveness of operations," end of quote. Instead of imposing new gun regulations, why don't we allocate the U.S. Department of Justice the necessary resources to prosecute these criminals? Law enforcement at schools should not be a foreign concept to any of you. At my boarding school, there is a police officer who is in charge of campus security. Similarly, Elon has campus security as well as campus police. We cannot overlook the fact that just this year, campus police, in conjunction with Elon Town Police, stopped Alexis Gray from coming to campus with a knife and firearm. Campus police deserve enormous credit because they saved lives that day. I don't want to flood you with numbers and statistics, but there is one poll that I want to highlight. An organization called Police One conducted a poll of over 15,000 police officers. 96% of those police officers said that a ban on high-capacity magazines will not reduce violent crime rates. Similarly, 70% said a ban on assault rifles would not reduce the violent crime rate. And 20% actually said that a ban on assault weapons would have a negative impact. I encourage you all to look up this poll so that you can read the rest of the report. My point, the discussion about gun violence should not be limited to imposing new gun regulations. Mental illness, the prosecution of criminals, or lack thereof, suicide. In fact, did you know that 59% of all firearm deaths in 2009 were suicides? That's scary. That's really scary. No one's talking about it. I hope that tonight we can address some of the aspects of gun violence that are often overlooked, intentionally and unintentionally, so that we can get closer to finding practical and effective solutions. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Patrick Brown, and I'm a junior at Elon University. First off, I'd like to thank Dr. Arcaro and the Elon community for not only organizing, but supporting this event. I decided to participate in this panel to share my thoughts on the role of our modern culture in gun violence. And I believe there are two major ways in which our culture contributes to increasing gun violence. First, many parts of our daily lives, from video games to movies, seem to allow more gun violence into them and to make it acceptable. For example, a movie from, say, the 1950s might show the bad guys getting shot bloodlessly and falling to the ground, while movies today, like Django Unchained, which recently came out, are extremely bloody and very violent. Video games similarly allow gamers to act as first-person shooters and to kill realistic opponents in a very lifelike way. Our senses are increasingly dulled through this to the horror of killing. We don't think about what it really means, and therefore it's not surprising that gun violence is increasing like this. A second issue I see is that guns are become common through video games and movies in our culture. When in a proper setting, when you're firing a gun for the first time, you're taught how to properly handle it and how to safely use it. If you're playing a video game, your character might just pick up a gun and start firing at random. There's no training for how you're going to handle it like you would have in real life. This important step is often bypassed and makes guns seem trivial, and we need to return to seeing guns as tools which should be respected, not toys which can be used inconsequentially. It's clear that those who committed the shootings which led to this panel did not treat guns as tools, nor respect them. I'm sure that many of you know, students I mean at least, people who play a few hundred hours of Call of Duty and seem to think that they are experts on guns. They know the make, they know the bullet, they know the power, but they've never actually fired it, but they claim to be experts. There have been numerous calls for video games or movies to be restricted in the wake of shootings such as Sandy Hook and Aurora, Colorado, and 3 pieces of legislation on that topic were proposed in Congress. However, all those pieces of legislation have since been taken off the table. Although there's currently no scientific data which links violence in video games or movies to violence that occurs in real life or gun violence, it can certainly be seen that there's correlation. In fact, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie recently asked the state legislature to pass a bill which would require minors purchasing mature-rated video games to do so with parental consent. Of course, there are many other measures which we can take to restrict gun violence. This could be background checks, ammunition restrictions, or clip sizes. However, all these are hotly debated and rather partisan. I think that the best first step is to encourage an environment of respect and less violence, which is a good start that all Americans will appreciate and allow us to move forward respectfully with this conversation about the future of how to restrict and prevent gun violence. Thank you.
My name is Jeff Carpenter. I'm faculty in the School of Education. Schools must be safe places. Our nation's children must be able to focus on learning and not worry about violence. Mass shootings draw a great deal of attention to school safety, but have yet to prompt actions that make these tragedies a thing of the past. The Columbine shootings occurred in 1999, but as the years pass, we have seen more tragedies such as Virginia Tech and Newtown. Recently, the National Rifle Association sponsored a study of school safety that recommends the voluntary arming of selected school employees. I reject the idea that arming more adults in our schools is good for our children. An armed sheriff's deputy was present at Columbine High School and did not prevent that tragedy. And the presence of police and/or armed guards in schools is not without costs. Do we raise a generation that believes guns everywhere equals safety? How long will it be before there's an accident or misuse of guns if they are commonplace in schools? There is already evidence that the very presence of police in schools can have negative consequences for some students whose adolescent misbehavior becomes treated as criminal behavior. Instead of this fight fire with fire approach, we need a more long-term and comprehensive strategy for addressing the mental and emotional health of our students and school communities. Guidance counselors are overwhelmed with responsibility for hundreds of students and cannot provide much actual counseling. School psychologists are similarly spread thin, and standardized testing pressures mean teachers spend less time teaching character and nurturing the kinds of relationships with students that can be powerful deterrents to violence. The real solution to the epidemic of violence in our country is in the long, hard, and unglamorous work of developing our children's relationships, mental health, and characters. Second, in the short term, we do need better gun regulation in this country. Contrast our inaction with what happened in the United Kingdom in the wake of the Dunblane school massacre in 1996. The UK adopted some of the most restrictive gun legislation in the world. And meanwhile, in the US, shooting after shooting failed to result in better gun control. I'm not even advocating for the level of restrictions that were created in the wake of the Dunblane massacre. I simply suggest that some more regulation is needed. We consent to the government regulating things such as ladders, seat belts, and speed limits in order to increase safety. There are even certain raw cheeses that are banned in our country. If we can have cheese regulation, can we please have gun regulation that is a little more effective? 12 years ago, there was one failed shoe bomb attempt, and ever since, we've been taking off our shoes to go through airport security. Surely we can accept some inconveniences and restrictions on gun purchasing and use when, on average, there are more than 30,000 gun fatalities per year in the United States. Let's take action so that 10 years from now, we can look back and see that something good came out of the Newtown tragedy and that schools became safer places as a result. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily Delphine, and I am a member of the class of 2014. As a Human Service Studies and Public Health Studies double major, I'm going to speak very briefly about the impact of gun violence on the health system and the overall population health, in hopes to persuade you that we do need to improve our gun laws. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2010, of the 180,000 injury-related deaths, almost 32,000 were a result of firearms. It is unclear as to whether these were a result of gun violence or suicide and unintentional incidents, but of the 16,000 homicides in 2010, 11,000 of those were related to firearms. The Bureau of Justice Statistics indicated that in 2011, there were over 400,000 non-fatal firearm assaults, which is a significant increase from the 378,000 incidents in 2010. Non-fatal firearm incidents can result in life-altering injuries, such as traumatic brain injuries, being paralyzed, or simply chronic pain. These injuries may require lengthy hospital stays, piles of hospital bills, inabilities to go to work, and many other things that will affect the day-to-day life of the victims. Mental health concerns, such as depression and anxiety, may also follow as a result of gun violence, which then places more burden on the health and our health professionals. For those of you who are interested in the economic perspective of health, the CDC found that gun-related injuries or deaths accounted for $5.6 billion in hospital bills every year, and $64.6 billion in the loss of productivity as a result. Therefore, not only does gun violence deplete the overall health of the population of the United States, but it places an extreme burden on the healthcare system and the cost of such. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Robin French, and I'm a member of the class of 2014. There are 3 things I'd like to talk about tonight, 2 of which directly relate to my major. I'm a math education major. The first doesn't completely relate to it, but it is a cause for concern for me. I believe that the role of the media does not play a positive role in the event of something like Newtown or Columbine. After Newtown, they focused so much on the perpetrator. I'd be willing to bet that the majority of you in this room could name the man responsible for killing those 26 teachers and students that day. They tend to focus less on the victims. I know I'm also very guilty of this assumption that I've made. I could tell you that it was Adam Lanza. I could not tell you one of the victims that was killed. I know the principal was one, but I could not tell you her name. And I'm embarrassed by that. I'm currently working on a project for a sociology class on the role of gun violence in schools with 3 other members of my class. And in our findings, I watched a small clip from a Dr. Phil show when he interviewed some of the Newtown victims. The parents had to put a sign over the doorbell that said, "Please do not ring the doorbell," because their son, who was in one of the classrooms that day, freaked out when somebody rang the doorbell because he was so traumatized and he thought a monster was coming. Another finding of mine, a parent from the Columbine shootings became a licensed counselor to help victims deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. This happened 14 years ago. Today, her daughter is still battling depression and drug addiction. It also took her years to set foot back into the classroom. I believe that the media should focus more on the victims in the short term and in the long term than on the perpetrators. It's not worth it to give them 5 seconds of fame because it turns into hours of coverage. And still, we're hearing about Adam Lanza. I also believe that bullying is a huge cause for gun violence. The Columbine shooters were both bullied. So was the Virginia Tech shooter. Cynthia Lowen recently spoke at Elon and shared her documentary, Bully. While I did not see the documentary in full, I did see a clip of it. And some schools are not addressing the issue of bullying at all. I believe if we address this issue at the root, we might be able to stop it at the core and save the victims and the victims of bullying as well as the people that they made victim as a result. And finally, Dr. Carpenter already touched on this a bit, teacher defense training. I believe as a teacher I should invest time in becoming a better teacher, not in learning how to operate a gun. While I would do what those Newtown teachers did and protect every single one of my students, I believe that classrooms should be a safe haven for kids, fostering development and growth, and not arming teachers to protect their students. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Zoey Heiberg, and I'm part of the freshman class. The issue of gun control is obviously one of great controversy in today's society. I myself was motivated to join this panel to bring attention to the fact that much of the opinions that the public make are based more on their emotional responses to such horrific occurrences as the Sandy Hook shooting, rather than on the actual facts. Groups advocating for stricter gun laws have painted guns as the enemy, using these violent events to prove that guns are to blame. When something horrific, such as the Sandy Hook shooting, occurs, the public generally wants to find something to blame, something to back up why this has happened, and these groups are trying to put it on the guns. They play into the public's emotions in order to gain support, but in reality, guns are not the problem. 2 points that I want to address today. The first one is that the belief that we should be working towards making guns legal in order to decrease violence. The mass killings involving guns that have occurred over the past few years would have occurred whether or not guns were illegal. The people committing such acts are not concerned about going against the law. Instead, they're usually obtaining these weapons illegally in the first place. To continue, the general people would not be able to defend themselves then. The only people who would have these weapons would be the ones that would be doing the damage. Taking away our right to bear arms leaves us in a vulnerable state. We are no longer on the same ground as those who still have the guns, the ones that are abusing the right to begin with. The second issue that I'd like to address is the argument that stricter gun control would prevent accidental gun injuries and deaths. Incidents such as the accidental shooting of the sheriff's wife by the 4-year-old neighbor in Tennessee that happened a couple weeks ago is an example of poor storage of weapons, not the result of gun laws being too lax. The safety was not on the gun, nor were there locks on the gun. To continue, the fact that there were children present and the owner of the gun still decided to take the gun out and show it off are the real reasons why this event happened, not because he owned a gun. Instead of pushing for stricter gun regulations, it maybe would be more beneficial to push for improving laws on how to store a gun, such as requiring safes, maybe on a different area away from the house, in a shed, or in a locked area where children cannot access it and people who are not trained to handle the guns cannot access it. There are many possible solutions to lowering the crime rate that is related to guns. However, voting to tighten the laws on guns or making them illegal is not one of them. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jason Springer. I work here in the Office of Academic Advising. I'm also a member of the National Rifle Association and the American Civil Liberties Union. I belong to these organizations because I believe that at their core, they aspire to limit the reach of government. I've also been a North Carolina concealed handgun permit holder for more than a decade. Additionally, I'm a former firearms blogger and locally competitive pistol shooter. Like many, I own and frequently legally possess firearms for two reasons: sport shooting and personal and family safety. For me, firearms rights issues are civil rights issues. Recent Supreme Court decisions Heller and McDonald have affirmed that citizens have the right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, including self-defense. We are and will continue to be a society where private citizens legally own and possess firearms. Within this basic context, there are two fundamental questions that I have. One, how do we balance public safety with individual liberty? And two, what societal ills must we cure to continue to slow the rate of violence? While the Supreme Court will certainly weigh in on legal restrictions to the Second Amendment, let me suggest the following. Number one, we should look to states for leadership. Trust in the federal government is near historic lows. Citizens have generally favorable views of state government. Elected officials are more accessible and accountable at the state level, and this would address the fact that one size may not fit all. Number two, we need to focus on the entire problem. What roles do poverty, education, media, parenting, drug policy, mental health policy, and popular culture have on violence? Number three, we should demand that our elected officials are honest and educated on issues. In early April, the lead sponsor of a federal ban on high-capacity magazines in the United States House of Representatives, speaking at a public forum, clearly had no understanding of how the very magazines she seeks to regulate function. This is just one of many examples of how uneducated lawmakers are misguided in their efforts. Number four, our anemic media must do some actual reporting rather than simply repeat political talking points. For example, rather than discussing gun show sales and online sales, the majority of which are perfectly legal and require background checks, what the media should be discussing are dealer sales versus private sales. Number five, we must be restrained with new policies, new fees, and increased bureaucracy. Do we really want to restrict access to firearms from citizens of a lower socioeconomic status through expensive, bureaucratic, and time-consuming licensing procedures similar to those that followed the Heller decision in Washington, D.C.? Do we want to continue to set precedent where individual liberties give way to the concepts of public safety and the greater good? I urge caution when we seek to diminish the rights of the few for the perceived safety of the many. I will conclude by saying this, that if this conversation is only about gun control, the national conversation about gun control, we will have failed completely in the conversation. At their core, I believe that any modifications or additions to current laws made in the name of public safety must defer to individual civil rights. Thank you.
Kind of nervous. I'm Megan Squire. I'm a professor here at Elon. And the reason why I'm speaking here today is because of my personal experience with domestic violence and a question that I have about gun laws. So every day I live with the reality that there is a person living in my community who's acted violently toward me in the past and could do so again. I'm not really sure how to describe to you what that feels like. A judge found cause to grant me a protective order against that person, which is a piece of paper that I have to carry on my body all the time in case there's another incident. And it tells the police how to respond and what has happened before. And that piece of paper also said that that person had to surrender any guns that he had. And it said he couldn't buy any new guns for the duration of the order. In North Carolina, not all protective orders require that gun surrender. It's up to the judge, who bases his or her decision on the pattern of behavior that's occurred. I mean, it's a pretty big deal to take away somebody's constitutional rights, even temporarily, so the pattern of behavior has to be compelling to do that. Anyway, I was glad about that part of the protective order. It's better safe than sorry, right? but I don't really understand all the loopholes in the gun laws, and I was pretty clueless when I first heard about all this. What I didn't realize was that it's actually possible to get a pretty powerful rifle at a gun show without any kind of background check from an unlicensed dealer. And that confused me because it seemed like the law is just saying, we know you can get a rifle at a gun show, and we could background check you there, but we're not going to do that. So just don't get a gun, okay? By not requiring background checks for all purchases, we're just basically hoping that the exact people who can't pass a background check will all of a sudden be level-headed and law-abiding and will restrain themselves. And that just doesn't seem very realistic to me. Why are we okay with this loophole? I just don't understand it. And I should probably add that I don't really want to be standing up here at all, and it's pretty scary to say these things, and it feels awful to think that there's people that might be discounting what I say or blaming me or whatever. But last week, 45 senators voted that his ability to buy a gun illegally is more important than my right to be safe, and I decided that I'm tired of being ashamed of what happened to me and to my family, and I'm going to speak out for those who have it way worse than I do. Ignoring loopholes like this is not fair, and we can do better.
Good evening. My name is Deanna Stanton, and I would like to continue tonight's discussion with a focus on the gender-related and domestic violence implications of gun use. History indicates that a significant incongruence lies in how our culture justifies the stark contrast between the standard of male power with some level of female subjugation. Sex-selective abortions, astounding rates of sexual violence, and unattainable societal expectations for ideal femininity add to the evidence of the gender stratification present in our society. It is no surprise, then, that a link between gun use and violence against women is apparent across the globe. Within the United States, domestic abuse and gender-based violence exist in countless capacities. While we recognize that men and women alike have been and continue to be the unfortunate victims of abuse, rape, and domestic homicide, data shows that females comprise the majority of victims. 25% of the 8,000 females surveyed by the National Institute of Justice reported that they were the victims of such violence by an intimate partner, compared to 7.6% of men who reported the same results. The Coalition for Gun Control reports that women are 3 to 4 more times likely than men to be the victims of spousal homicide. Of all such cases, firearms are the most commonly used weapons. Based on research conducted by Futures Without Violence, access to firearms increases the risk of intimate partner homicide by more than 5 times. Additionally, intimidation by partners with access to guns decreases the chance that victims will pursue opportunities to leave their abusers. It is clear that the possession of firearms by owners and purchasers who have not undergone sufficient screening, as well as those who are not held accountable by some form of regulatory board, further increases the power differential between males and females, thus indicating that the need for more holistic gun control is not only a federal, local, and state issue, but a women's health and social justice issue as well. We owe it to ourselves and to our progeny to work in hopes of eradicating the fear attributed to gun violence. It is imperative that we acknowledge that the great number of homicides and mass deaths that are completed each year with firearms point to the weaknesses in our current system of gun regulation. An imminent change in how the United States and world at large manages violence is necessary for the improvement in the quality of human existence and our collective moral consciousness. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. That may have prompted questions. So remember, and available to you in the aisles are people to pick up your question cards. So they'll be walking around, just hold them up, and for this next portion, continue to hold up questions as you have them. So we're going to transition now to our invited panelists. And I want one other comment. We are tweeting tonight's event for those online too. It's hashtag EU Gun Debate. So now we turn to our invited guest, and we'll first hear from Reverend Richard McBride, Elon's Distinguished Chaplain Emeritus.
I'm glad to see a good number of folks from the community because you've just seen the kind of conversation that happens in the university setting. Very thoughtful men and women, staff and students who give a great deal of attention to what they want to say and to say it clearly. So thanks to all of you for being here. I do not own a gun except a BB gun, and there aren't any BBs at home. My dad's 2 rifles went to my brother and my son. My son, however, is an Apache helicopter pilot, so if the family needs to balance out, he provides the balance. There are a number of points to take up, but let me just take up the notion of reasonable regulation. Our Second Amendment offers us declares for us that we have the right to bear arms. I think some people only hear that it says that. You may know that it also says in the beginning that there is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the Supreme Court in recent decisions has decided 5-4 that the individual right to bear arms is preeminent, whereas the community, the other 4 justices said this is a communal right that communities would form militias. There's still a debate going on. It's 5-4. We're not unanimous in our view about what this right means. But I want to point to what I believe are some reasonable regulations. One just addressed by one of the speakers is the loopholes that exist that certainly should be closed. Megan's question is just still ringing in my ears. Why would it be possible for a person who has a domestic order against them to be still able to go buy an assault rifle? This just seems absurd on its face, beyond what reasonableness would suggest is necessary. You know, Joe Biden is an interesting guy. And on the issue of magazine clips, when they were talking about whether we might restrict the magazine clip to 10 clips, he said, if you need more than 10 rounds to hunt, and some argue they hunt with that number of rounds, you shouldn't be hunting. If you can't get the deer in 3 shots, you shouldn't be hunting. You're an embarrassment. Well, that strikes me also as a reasonable regulation, that we would limit the size of the magazines that are available to sportsmen. It's not a perfect solution. None of these are perfect solutions, but if they can reduce the possibility of danger to other human beings, why don't we embrace them? The North Carolina legislature at the moment has a bill before it that would allow for guns to be on college campuses within the state university system. That wouldn't apply to Elon. We could still declare against it. But here's the reason why I think that is not a good idea, and it has to do with the impulsivity of youth. Those who study brain development tell us that the part of the brain that governs judgment isn't really fully wired until your mid-20s and late 20s. No wonder teenagers have trouble with impulse control. So if we had more guns available, as last night at Arizona State's fraternity party, rage simply reached for a gun. I don't want more guns surrounding our campus community, so when folks are enraged, they have that sort of weapon to reach for. There are reasonable limits on how much lethality we should have in our communities. I'll just stop with that.
Good evening. I came to Elon in 1978 and graduated in 1983. You can do the math. It's a good place to be. I began my service in law enforcement after graduation, first with the Burlington Police Department. Then I moved to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, and am currently with the Town of Elon Police Department. In my 30 years in law enforcement service, I know there are people willing to commit violent crimes, and I know there's no single solution. I recognize there's a delicate balance between the right to own firearms, the regulation of firearms, and the banning of certain firearms. While this has caused strong responses on both sides, I know that anytime we come together, like we are tonight, to talk to one another and to listen to one another, we often find that we are not that far apart, which gets us closer to solutions. I would also like to say, take this time just to say, I would encourage, particularly our students here, that you should consider public service, whether it be in the law enforcement arena or any of the branches of service. It's a wonderful way to give back. It's a wonderful way to help others, and it's a wonderful way to be part of solutions. I would also like to say, I hadn't planned to say this, but Megan, using up the time. I just want to tell you that I'm sorry you were victimized, and but I'm proud of you because you've taken steps already in your life, particularly tonight, to take back the parts that somebody tried to take away from you, the parts of your life. And I, for one, stand with you. I don't, you know, I don't have all the answers. I don't know that we'll ever come to those, but you're one of the reasons I have chosen to serve in law enforcement. And I would just say that I think that, you know, you do not deserve any shame. Do not be ashamed. Often these people that do these kind of crimes, they're the problem. They're the cowards. I'll use that strong term. So you're a very strong person, so we stand with you, and so I just wanted to take time to say that to you. So.
Hi, I'm Celo Faucette, and I'm a member of Burlington City Council, and I am a gun owner. I've been a gun owner for quite some time, and I'm proud of it. But there's a couple of issues I'd like to go back to that affects us here locally. And it's how firearms get in our community. Where do they come from? How can we stop it? How have firearms been passed down from one person to the next person? I think a lot of that has to be put into focus. The mental health issue has to be put into focus. How are people able to obtain guns when there is some type of mental illness that they have a record of some type of mental illness? I think, and I may be wrong with the chief, that some HIPAA laws, government laws may require that you not release that information, whether they have mental illness or not. It's something that we have to look at. But guns are here, and again, I want to be here locally. I know we have a national problem, but how can we protect our citizens here? How can we stop the guns from flowing into Alamance County? We have people that go from Greensboro, Durham, Raleigh, that purchase guns on the street, bring them right back to Alamance County. That gun is sold down to the next person. Those are the issues that we have to face. You know, how can we stop the gun violence in our communities? Burlington, Alamance County is 100-some thousand people. There may be a gun for every person in Alamance County. Who knows? We don't have enough law enforcement to go door to door to search homes to see who has guns legally and illegally. So by me being a gun owner, I really think that a responsible gun owner, I think most people that own firearms are responsible. The ones that commit the crimes are irresponsible. But I ask that the community look at all these aspects, know what we're going out there after. Again, with the mental illness, the funds have been cut for mental illness. That's a part of that I would like to see put in the gun permit portion of it. When you go obtain your gun permit, and it may be in there, I really don't know, but I'd like to see it in there. When you get your gun permit, take the fingerprint, so that fingerprint goes along with that gun permit. So there's a lot of options out there that we can put into place to gain some control of this. I call it an epidemic that's going around in our country with guns. But I've got all my guns are 3-shot guns. So I don't have anything with big banana clips or anything like that. Yeah, when I get through shooting my 3, I'm through and reload. So, but I think that's what we have to look at. Is just how can we control guns in our neighborhood and then go state and national. But this is my biggest concern. It's what's happening here to our citizens in Alamance County. Thank you.
I'm trying to see if I can reach this microphone. I'm a little bit hoarse. My name is Steve Ross. I'm a representative in the North Carolina General Assembly in Raleigh. First of all, I want to thank the university for the opportunity to be here to be a part of this panel tonight. Also want to commend the students and I think a couple of maybe faculty members for their comments that they made earlier. Very well thought out, and some of the statistics and some of the numbers that you talked about, you researched items sometimes much better than my colleagues in debate in the General Assembly, and my hat's off to you for that. But you touched on something that I think we really, the core issue of what's going on, and the term is violence. And I think we all recognize that society's gotten more violent. As I was looking at some of the statistics that we use in different pieces of legislation, trying to find ways to make society safer, if we can, I was looking at some of the numbers for 2010 for North Carolina. Overall violent deaths in North Carolina, and this is not gun deaths, this is just overall violent deaths, in 2010 were 1,790. That's a lot of violent deaths in North Carolina. Some of the numbers that struck me or stood out were the suicide numbers. The suicide numbers during that same period were 1,777, and that's just in North Carolina. And of course, homicide represented about 507. You've all touched on a lot of great issues as to why these things are going on, why it's happening. A lot of us are old enough, Chief Parker, to remember a time when you left your doors unlocked, your keys in your car, and that kind of thing. And I think we all recognize that times have changed, and that's not the case anymore. There are many, many, many factors that go into violence. You've touched on many of them here tonight. Drugs is a big issue. Prior to going to the General Assembly, I spent 16 years on the City Council and a couple of terms as mayor in Burlington. Worked closely with my police department on these very same issues. The drug traffic coming into Burlington, that generates some of the problem. Some of the domestic violence issues, I mean, that was on the increase, and trying to deal with that. One thing that is still troubling to me is the number of crimes committed against children in this country. And there are so many different ways that these things happen. You just have to ask yourself the question, what's going on in people's minds? You've mentioned mental illness. But I contend that there's some other things that are going on in society that are causing things to get a little bit more violent. Just in Raleigh last week, we had a high-profile homicide. It was done with a knife. So there are just so many issues that are involved in violence, and I think it's great to be able to open up a dialogue and talk about all of the issues, because I don't think you can pin the violence that's going on in society right now on any one thing. I think it's a multitude of things, and look forward to the dialogue.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm a professor at Elon Law School down in Greensboro, and I've been asked to discuss what the Constitution says about gun ownership. And as we heard earlier, the Second Amendment to the Constitution says, and I'll just read it all in full so we have it in our heads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And in 2 recent opinions, the Supreme Court has kind of outlined some things about that right and the extent of that right. The first is that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. It's not a collective right. It's an individual right. It was a 5-4 decision, but 5 wins. So the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. The second is that this right arose from a historic right that individuals had to self-defense and to the right to resist tyranny. So that's the foundation, why we have the Second Amendment, is self-defense to resist tyranny. And the third thing I want to point out is that the right to keep and bear arms, like every other right enshrined in the Constitution, is not absolute. It is subject to limitations. Your right to free speech is subject to limitations. Your right to bear arms is subject to limitations. Your right to be free from searches and seizures is subject to limitations. And so the question boils down to what limitations are allowed. And the Supreme Court overturned in those 2 cases a flat ban on the ownership of handguns in the District of Columbia on the theory that that ban prevented people from being able to exercise their right of self-defense. And then in the second case, where they dealt with the Second Amendment, they overturned more creative legislation from the city of Chicago that essentially achieved the same end. So we know from that Supreme Court precedent that the government cannot restrict ownership of handguns, prevent ownership of handguns, because handguns are central to the right of self-defense. But they also suggested that many longstanding limitations on the keeping and bearing of arms remain valid, constitutional. So limitations on possession of firearms by felons, possession of firearms by the mentally ill, the carrying of guns in schools and government buildings, and any conditions and some conditions and qualifications on commercial gun sales. So where does that leave us? Well, it tells us that the Second Amendment does answer some questions, but it leaves a lot of them unanswered for us. It is not going to tell us what we as a society or what our legislators specifically can and cannot do. So certainly the government can't ban all guns. They can't take all guns away. That would violate the Second Amendment. But at the same time, it does seem to leave the door open to substantial regulation of the rights to keep and bear arms, so long as those regulations don't overburden your right to self-defense and your ability to resist tyranny with firearms. And that leaves a lot of space for legislative action and decisions to be made by society more generally, which of course is the subject of this whole discussion. But I guess I kind of wanted to make clear that the Constitution doesn't necessarily answer all of those questions. And then finally, one other comment that I'll pull from my experience as a criminal law professor is that we need to understand what criminal laws seek to do. Criminal laws don't seek to, or they seek to, but they never can, prevent all instances of criminal conduct. Murderers, people who are committed to committing murder, will always kill somebody if they have the opportunity. And so criminalizing murder doesn't achieve the end of wiping out murder. It's too bad. You know, we wish it could, but it can't. Rather, criminal laws seek to deter, and they seek also to shape societal norms. We criminalize murder in part to communicate to everybody that murder is wrong. And so when we talk about the potential of criminalizing things, we ought to keep in mind that the goal of criminalization is to wipe it out, but it can't do that. And so to argue against criminalization on the grounds that the conduct will still occur is not really that great of an argument. It misunderstands what the criminal law seeks to do. So if we're going to try to discuss the opportunity to criminalize things, we at least ought to understand how the criminal law works. It doesn't tell us criminalization is the right answer, but at least gives us some context. So thanks.
So at this time, before we go into the Q&A, I want to remind everyone that after this event is over, we're going to be having a very informal reception over at Fireside Lounge so that these conversations and insights can continue. The panelists, both community and expert, will be there to answer any more questions that you have and talk through some things. And on behalf of the planning committee for this event, I want to take some time to thank the community panelists, thank the expert panelists for being here tonight, and I want to thank all of you for coming out and being here and supporting this sort of conversation. So again, on behalf of the Planning Committee, I hope you've gained insight and a better understanding of the many issues, and I hope you've gotten a lot out of this event tonight. So I'll invite Dr. Book up here again to continue with the question and answer session.
So we have lots of questions, so that's good. These questions, I'm going to also open it up. There's a mic available to the speakers who provided, so that if you feel prompted, feel free to raise your hand and I'll recognize it's you as well. And what I'll do is read the question and then make available anyone who would like to respond to it to do so, and allow a couple of responses to the question and then move to the next so that we can hear many of these questions tonight. So the first one is related to the unemployment and the economics, and we actually had two related to this, and so I'll read them. If unemployment stays at 7% or more for the next 6 or 8 years, and people become more needy and desperate, law-abiding citizens will have to protect themselves, needing guns, correct? And then the other one is, do you agree that poverty could be a core issue across the United States and that it relates to the lack of mental health care, gang violence, and gun misuse? If so, what should be done to solve this core issue? So those are kind of related about economics and how does that play into the issue of gun violence?
Is that just open for anyone?
Yeah, anyone who'd like to jump in.
Well, in my day job, or my job outside the General Assembly, I work in financial services and with economics, and it is a proven fact that in economic tough times, you can go back and look at recessions, for example, prolonged recessions. Criminal activity goes up. We know that locally. We can see the statistics, and we also know that that takes place nationally. So anything that we can do to lower unemployment, foster better working conditions, obviously will have an impact on the statistics.
Another question. What are state legislators doing to enforce stricter punishment for felons with firearms? My uncle was murdered by a felon with a firearm.
I guess I'll have to take that one. We have reached a point now in the General Assembly this year where we're in excess of about 1,100 bills just on the House side that have been introduced. A good number of these pieces of legislation, some have already passed, are increasing penalties, making some misdemeanors have become felonies. I mean, we're really trying to tighten laws where laws need to be tightened in criminal activity to try to again, make things safer. I'll go to domestic violence. One of the bills that I was involved in this morning in Judiciary was we had a debate on a bill on the protective orders that we know don't work. Yet they're given out all the time. Judges use protective orders, and that's their way of saying, okay, I think, you're going to be safe. We know it doesn't work. So one of the pieces of legislation that's being debated right now is one that requires GPS tracking devices on those that have these orders placed on them. In other words, for example, if someone committed a piece of domestic violence against, say, their spouse, and the judge ordered them not to, for whatever reason, come within a certain perimeter of that person, we know from past experience and statistics that it just doesn't work. And when law enforcement is called, typically it's that person's word against the other. However, the GPS device, and I can't tell you how it works, it's technology, it's over my head, but the example that was given to us this morning in the judiciary was that this device will trigger an alarm not only for law enforcement, but an alarm for the victim should that person come within a certain range of the individual. Is that going to solve all the problem? No. There's still going to be problems. There are going to be people, even with the tracking device on, that are going to go, into the forbidden zone. But it's a step in the right direction. It's a step, trying to work with the issue, recognizing it's a problem, knowing protective orders don't necessarily work. It's a step in the right direction to try to protect the individual that needs the protection from the protective order. So there are a number of different issues that we're debating right now, as well as increasing some of the penalties, misdemeanors to felonies. It's a long process. It's never going to make us totally safe, but we just keep trying.
Another question. Please address the anti-gun regulation position in light of suicide. Of the more than 30,000 gun deaths each year, 20,000 are suicides, and of these, most of the guns are obtained in the home. Would not more regulation stem this tide? I'd actually like the chief to answer this, because I know you're often called as a police officer to the scene of a suicide, and just curious what your thoughts are on.
Well, I think you're dealing with a person that has come to the level that they're prepared to take their own life. I think we're dealing with issues outside of just the firearm issue, because we've seen, over my career, I've seen, unfortunately, other methods than firearms. It is a high percentage, and that's that balance we talk about between a firearm that is legally owned and possessed, and then is, in some cases, used by the person that legally possessed it against themselves. And and at the time a firearm was purchased or was available, the person themselves or the person in the home may not have been in that state of mind. So I don't know if there is an easy answer about regulating firearms in light of suicide, because there's not always a predictive measure about what's going to happen with the firearm, what a person chooses to do, where they are in that stage of life, So.
Okay, another question. For 2,000 years, and I'm going to try to read this handwriting. Strong men ruled the world with swords. When the Chinese invented gunpowder, it changed this forever. Now, an 80-year-old grandmother can live alone and defend herself with a firearm, not with a sword. Should you go back to swords, or should we continue to allow Granny to be able to stand up for herself?
I think Granny has a right to stand up for herself. If she's able to use it, then go for it, Granny.
Well, it's an interesting question about have the availability of handguns in some way afforded people disempowered independence because of their availability?
I think in some instances it may, because if they're of sound body and mind, and they're able to take care of themselves and protect themselves, and certainly.
Article for one of my classes that went along with that sort of train of thought, and there are mainly like two ways of which things like occur. You either have it happen by force or it's by choice, and guns allow people to do this by choice, because if I'm not very tall, I'm not muscular, but if I'm being attacked by someone twice my size and I have a gun, I'm on the same playing field as them, versus without that protection, I'm a lot less, I'm more helpless. So I don't know, in that sense, I think it's more beneficial to be able to defend yourself in that light.
I think this issue touches on whether or not we should be allowed to use high-capacity magazines. High-capacity magazines make sense for criminals. Or let me rephrase that. Should criminals be able to use high-capacity magazines? No. But should Granny be able to have more than 10 shots? She may not be a very good shot. Does limiting the number of bullets she can use to protect herself make sense?
We did have a point of clarification, so I'm going to ask you to pass the mic to Jason Springer. And one of the questions was just a clarification about who can buy a gun at a gun show.
Yeah, I'm glad I got this question, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what a gun show is and what happens at a gun show. So a gun show is essentially a flea market where guns are bought, sold, traded. You can buy ammunition, you can buy accessories, etc. The people essentially selling firearms, in my experience, and I've probably been to 2 or 3 dozen gun shows in the state of North Carolina over the last 20 years or so, my general experience has been is that at those gun shows, federally licensed dealers sell a significant portion, I would say certainly the majority of firearms, again, at the gun shows that I've been to, and each of those guns must undergo a background check when it's sold through a federally licensed dealer. Now, if we're talking about private sales are an option at a gun show. They're an option at in the parking lot of the Walmart here in Burlington. I mean, you have the option to sell your firearms privately in the state of North Carolina. Long guns are not subject in those private sales to background checks. Now, an individual may morally decide, I'm not selling this firearm, this long gun, this rifle or shotgun, to someone who doesn't produce a concealed handgun permit that would assure me that you've passed the background check in the past, or provide me with a concealed handgun permit that would show me that you've passed the background check in your recent history. But that is not required. For a long gun, you do not have to have a background check for that private sale, that person-to-person sale. Now, North Carolina Statute 14402 tells me that if I, as a private citizen, want to sell you a handgun, I'm required by state law to ask you or to basically require that you provide me one of those 2 pieces of documentation, your concealed handgun permit, again, which assures me you've been through a background check, or a pistol purchase permit that's been issued by the sheriff in the county where you reside, in addition to verifying your identification. So I hope that provides some clarification. So in sum, dealers' sales to private individuals all undergo background checks. Handgun sales, all handgun sales in the state of North Carolina are required to undergo background check. The process is slightly different, whether it's a dealer sale or a private sale. Now, policing that, I'm sure, is a bit of a nightmare, as it would be with the legislation that just failed. But that is the current law. Long guns are what I would consider to be, or I'm not going to say I'm going to consider it to be anything. Some consider it to be the loophole that exists in North Carolina state law.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. We have several questions about guns in schools. So I'm asking for people's opinion on the presence of guns in schools, and then the observation that some jurisdictions have moved police substations into elementary schools. What are your thoughts on this as a way to keep children safe at school?
I know with the city of Burlington, we put SROs in some of our schools here, and I think that's a deterrent. Sometimes it may be, sometimes it may not be, because with the instance in Connecticut, you know, this guy knew the school system. He knew where everybody was being placed in the system. So he had every opportunity to come in and start wherever he wanted to start. But I think when you have an SRO officer in the schools, it deters them because they never know where that SRO officer is going to be at that time once he comes in there. So with the SROs making rounds and making sure the kids are safe, and I think when the front office knows who's coming in that school, supposedly, because I think most of the doors are that's the only entrance in. The administration has a way to contact that SRO to let them know that something is somebody's coming in that may not be of sound mind that may cause trouble in there. But I think it's a good thing that we are able to provide SROs in our school systems.
Okay, so I worked in 3 different high schools. And one of the high schools I worked at, the SRO was involved in racial profiling of students. And so I think many SROs do good work and do contribute to some percentage of the students feeling safer at their school. But I think that it can be a little simplistic to think that an SRO is always a positive influence in the school. I think not all students are going to look at a uniformed police officer as someone who is going to make their school experience safer. We do have a history, and I'm not commenting towards any of the police officers in this room, but there is a history of racial profiling by police in this country that some communities in our schools will not feel like the presence of more armed officers will make the school a place that they're welcomed in or feel safer in.
Dr. Carpenter, could you also address like screening in schools where, you know, you go through a weapon, a radar kind of system to detect a weapon?
Yeah, so some schools do have metal detectors. I taught in a school that had those.
Are those effective in reducing crime?
So most schools have, you know, upwards of 10 or 15 entrances at high schools where I worked, and typically there's not metal detectors at all 10 or 15 entrances. So all you have to do is coordinate with someone to open a side entrance, and you can easily get a gun into a school. I mean, I can only speak anecdotally. So I have that officer came into my classroom and wanted to investigate desks, and he named students saying that students involved in gang violence, affiliated with gangs, and I want to see tagging on that desk. And I knew that student. I'd worked with that student for many months, and I know that this was completely off base. And again, I'm not, this is anecdotal. Racial profiling would not prevent school shootings. One of my students in Boston, who was African American, when one of the school shootings happened, said, "What is up with these crazy white kids?" So I do not, I mean, I'm not going to comment on racial profiling and its effectiveness, but I do not want it in any school that I work for. And I do not think it would contribute to a more positive school environment. But I'm going to make one final comment related to school environments, that I can also present statistics that show, there's multiple studies that show that minorities in American schools are disproportionately punished for committing the same misbehaviors as non-minorities. So you do the same thing and you get disproportionate punishment based on race in U.S. public schools. I can give you references for studies like that. And I'm going to not talk anymore.
Okay. Thank you. So we had several questions about mental health and the challenges of mental health and civil rights around protecting your mental health record and the need to be able to screen effectively for mental health in the gun permitting and gun sale. And so several questions. I'll just ask one to give you an example. It says, do you believe those with mental illnesses should be able to own a gun? If so, would you suggest mental health screening, and what sort of screening would be effective?
I'll start with an answer. I'm not sure I'd know how to begin a mental health screening that included us all. But it does seem to me that those who have been legally determined to be mentally ill should appear on a registry. And this is an issue of the difference among states. Some states are good at doing that, and many states are very poor at doing that. And I'd like to see more states buy into this notion that a person who's been legally determined to be of unsound mind appears on a registry.
That very topic and exactly what Reverend McBride's talking about is in discussion really as we speak. It was discussed in a committee this morning. It's part of a big debate in the gun legislation that's being tossed around, is trying to get the most effective method to keep the guns out of the hands of those that have some form of mental illness. You have to have a system of being able to identify, who these individuals are, and there are all kind of different methods being used. Fortunately, now technology is beginning to catch up to some of the issues and giving us some relief. But ultimately, it's going to come down to some sort of a registry that is almost like, and I don't want to. It'll be a record, similar to when you go and check someone's criminal background. They have a criminal record. If someone has an issue or has had issues with mental illness and been part of the system, then that's going to be tracked.
Professor Rich, did you have a?
Yeah, I just wanted to note, though, that while certainly mental health has played a role in a lot of the high-profile shootings that we've heard about recently, it's worth noting that mental health issues are not involved in the vast, vast majority of deaths resulting from gun violence. So while it's great, it would be fantastic if we could have an effective way to keep guns out of the hands of the dangerously mentally ill. It doesn't really solve the majority of the problem that we have.
Yeah. We have one here, too. Up next.
This is just a comment about the registry. One thing that we need to be careful about is that if we do create a registry, mental health is already a stigmatized identity. So I'm going to compare it to another stigmatized identity, HIV. Yes, there is a registry. When you get diagnosed with HIV, you do need to go to the health department, and you have to put yourself on a list. However, I cannot go and Google that registry and be able to find out who in this room has HIV, because that's for the health department. And then if they need to prosecute as things go on, that's how things need to happen. So if we do make a mental health registry, that needs to be for the appropriate audience, not something for a public venue. That's all.
Agreed. Well, I agree that we're desensitized to violence. Now, just why that happens, I don't know. But, gone is the day when we could settle a dispute by my slapping you with my glove and challenging you to a duel, one-on-one. We'll never get back to that day. Well, maybe we could, but I don't think that's likely to happen. Violence is the core issue to be resolved, and it's not resolved entirely by legislation. I think churches, synagogues, mosques, all such places of worship have a role to play in helping people manage their violence, manage their violent impulses. I'm going to go ask how much lethality do we need to have surrounding us? You know, I wonder how did we get to the point where what we now call an assault rifle is something that people want to possess? How did that shift happen? That we now need that kind of weaponry in our hands? What concerns me is the militarization of the family home. Do we all need a rocket-propelled grenade launcher? It would be fun. I wouldn't feel safer in my neighborhood if my neighbors had rocket-propelled grenade launchers. I mean, isn't there a rational limit somewhere? Well, back in 1934, the U.S. Congress decided that gangster guns could be put off limits. There have been a number of attempts since to say this kind of weaponry is not desirable in the community. And I think we've just, every increase in weaponry is something that we individuals want to possess, or many individuals want to possess. I don't see how that makes us safer. I think it does increase our capacity for violence. And I don't know how to put the genie back in the box.
So our time has come to a close this evening. Thank you to everyone for your thoughtful consideration of tonight's topic and the willingness and the courage to engage and share your thoughts with the community. I'm reminded of trustee and alumni Noel Allen's observation that differences of political or religious opinion are best ground in the crucible of an open university learning environment. So thank you for helping to create that environment tonight and demonstrate our commitment to be a community of respect. I also wanted to thank Ben Cashton and Tara Corbett, our student leaders who helped to create this event, as well as the faculty and staff who served on the planning committee. And thank you all to the members of our community and our invited guests and members of our community that came tonight to Elon University. Catherine Parsons kept us on track with attention to detail. And lastly tonight to Tom Arcaro, whose deep commitment to global civic engagement is evidenced by his leadership with tonight's event and every day on campus. Thank you, Tom.